2, 1.
Lasers on.
Bomb's gone. Bomb's gone.
Looking good.
10 seconds.
Shell 4-1, I've got a teleo. I think that's wedged to the south.
4, 3, 2,
My position
1.
for about 10
Should be
miles.
impact.
Boom! Oh, yes! We destroyed that thing bigger than Dallas.
In the space of just over 100 years, the world has witnessed incredible changes in military aviation. During the Great War, flyers first engaged in mortal combat over the trenches of the Western Front, flying a small number of rickety wood and fabric aircraft. 20 years later, the Allies of the Second World War would send 1,000 planes at a time streaming toward the cities of Nazi Germany. By the 21st century, supersonic stealth aircraft, armed with smart bombs, rained shock and awe on targets along the Tigris River. The idea of an airplane as a military weapon was being considered long before World War I. Just 5 years after the first manned power flight, the U.S. Army asked Orville Wright to demonstrate his flyer to a War Department review board. It was during one of these test flights at Fort Myer, Virginia, that Lieutenant Thomas E. Selfridge was killed. Selfridge became the first military man to die in an airplane. In August 1914, at the outbreak of the Great War in Europe, aircraft did not enter into the plans of the belligerents. The frontline troops of all nations slaughtering each other on the far-flung battlefields counted in the millions. But the number of total aircraft deployed by the combatants amounted to a little over 500 fragile, unarmed monoplanes and biplanes. Those early military pilots who were flying over the trenches of the Western Front were essentially aerial chauffeurs. Their job was to ferry an observer over the countryside to report on troop movements. In the first months of the war, there was plenty to observe, with the Germans overrunning Belgium and advancing on Paris.
A circular came round all cavalry divisions asking for lightweight, specified lightweight officers to volunteer to become observers.
The Royal Flying Corps was a very exclusive corps that frightfully hand-picked people in it, and the only people who could get into the Royal Flying Corps were people who were seconded from the regular regiments, and not only that, from the better class of the regular regiments, and so that was that. But I did pick up from the chap. Did I know anything about airplanes? I had to admit that I didn't. If I had known something about airplanes, they might have had two thoughts about it.
In those days, unless you were an officer, you weren't supposed to have sufficient brains to be capable of flying. It was sort of a closed shop, because it was only the officer class who could pay for his private tuition and civil life. It was simply a question of class.
In the east, German aviators located the advancing Russian army, allowing field commanders to move troops to where they were needed most and giving the outnumbered Germans an epic victory at Tannenberg. In the west, French aircraft returned to their base to report that the enemy's armies had made a fatal mistake and exposed their flank. This bit of intelligence allowed the French to turn the tide and doom Europe to 4 long years of trench warfare. In 1915, photography replaced sketches and handwritten notes as a technique for aerial reconnaissance. Aircraft with pilot observers equipped with unwieldy box cameras were sent out day after day over the front to take photographs of the endless trenches and gun emplacements. With freezing fingers, observers hung over the sides of their ship in gale-like slipstreams to get a shot at the enemy below. The job was unglamorous and dangerous.
The cavalry tended to be jealous of a new arm that might detract from their reconnaissance potential. I was moving away from an arm which was obviously having minimal active service, and that under conditions of gross discomfort.
The aircraft had to fly straight and steady, making it an inviting target from ground fire and eventually armed aircraft.
I wonder how long my nerves will stand this daily ground fire. I would not mind it so much if I were in a machine that was fast and that would climb a little more willingly. Well, I suppose the end will be pretty sharp and quick. Lieutenant William Reed, Royal Flying Corps.
In addition to observation, early warbirds began to drop bombs on the enemy. At first, the bombs were nothing more than hand grenades and converted artillery shells, but soon this was refined to projectiles capable of destroying factories and railroads. Russia became the first nation to project strategic air power by means of heavier-than-air bombers. In February of 1915, the Russians began sending a small number of Sikorsky Ilya Muromets 4-engine bombers into enemy territory. These first missions operated with impunity, but had little real effect on the war. By 1917, sturdier, specialized bombers began to appear with bomb racks and bomb sights. From the start of the war, the Germans had wanted to use heavier-than-air aircraft for strategic bombing, but lacked a suitable machine until the advent of the Gotha 2-engine bomber. The Gothas began raids on Britain in the summer of 1917 with impressive effect. Both the air defenses and the civilian population were unprepared for formations of bombers attacking in broad daylight. When 14 Gothas appeared over London for the first time on June 13, crowds of people ran into the streets to watch them. The bombs falling on them killed 162 people. The Gothas flew faster than the Zeppelins and were far harder to shoot down. When flying in formation, they could dish out heavy punishment to pursuing aircraft from their combined firepower. Because they could be produced much more quickly and cheaply than airships, they could be deployed in far greater numbers. The largest airplanes to fly in the Great War were the heavy bombers. The most famous of these R planes was the Zeppelin Staaken R-6, introduced in 1917. These huge machines had two pilots sitting side by side. They also carried mechanics who tended the engines in flight. It took 40 men to prepare the Giant for its mission, loading bombs, filling the fuel tanks, and turning the four 250-horsepower engines. After a light supper, the 8-man crew would board the aircraft that was waiting for them with engines idling. With only calculations of time, speed, and direction to tell them where they were, the bomber wing would lumber toward its British target.
Inside the fuselage, the pale glow of dimmed lights outlined the chart table, the wireless equipment, and the instrument panel. Under us, a black abyss. Hauptmann Arthur Schuler.
Suddenly in the night sky, they would see searchlights probing the sky, telling them they were at last over England. The bombers would fly straight ahead as their machine gunners tried to hit the lights below. Ahead, if they were lucky, would be a break in the clouds, through which the pilot and observer could see the Thames River and the docks covered with the tools of war. The observer would move forward to the open post in the nose from which he would release the bombs. With the release of the last bomb, they would turn for home. In the summer and fall of 1918, formations of Allied bombers began to fly raids deep into Germany. Predictably, bad weather and unreliable aircraft limited the effectiveness of the bomber offensive. But civilians in cities such as Frankfurt and Mannheim were taught the terror of air raids that had been experienced by inhabitants of Paris and London. The final assessment of World War I strategic bombing was not encouraging. At that stage of development, air power could not disrupt production nor weaken the population's will to fight. Bombing was costly and inaccurate. The building of large bombers was nonetheless an important step in the progress of aviation. Bomber crews had accumulated extensive experience in long-distance flight and night flying, and the large aircraft would be modified to carry passengers and freight. The strategic bombers of World War I paved the way for those who would follow. Raids were carried out in daylight when air superiority allowed it, and at night when it did not. By the end of the war, aircraft roamed the front, bombing bridges and airfields, and strafing troops, proving that the airplane had made the battlefield three-dimensional. Even before the Great War, the airship was fixed in the minds of the public as a symbol of terror. As early as 1908, H.G. Wells had described an airship raid on New York that left the city in ruins and blazing conflagrations and heaped and scattered dead. It was a vision that did not go unnoticed by some military commanders. Captain Peter Strasser, head of the German Navy's airship fleet, believed that Britain could be overcome by means of airships. The Germans had no monopoly on the intent to bomb enemy cities and industrial centers. But they did have the lead in airship technology, and in 1914, airships were the only aircraft capable of carrying large bomb loads far enough to strike strategic targets. However, at this stage of the war, no nation's air service was capable of fulfilling Wells' vision of aerial destruction. Metal-framed Zeppelins and plywood-framed Schutzlanzes revealed serious drawbacks in combat. They could not survive over the battlefield. Traveling at under 50 miles per hour, they present large, tempting targets for gunners on the ground and nimble fighters in the air. 4 huge airships were shot down in the first month of the war. The one weapon the airship had in its favor was stealth. On a moonless night, despite the bulk, Zeppelins could evade protection and pursuit. The great airships became night raiders. The Imperial German Army and Navy used airships to bomb a variety of strategic targets under the cover of darkness, including Paris. But the most prized target was London. German school children learned to sing, "Zeppelin fly, fly to England. England will burn in fire." The arrival of airships over Britain in 1915 made a deep impression on the helpless civilian population. None who heard the thumping of the Maybach engines or witnessed the dark silhouette passing overhead in the night ever forgot the experience. Yet airship commanders found mounting a sustained campaign risky. Flying from bases in the north of Germany or occupied Belgium to Britain and back in pitch darkness was a dangerous task. Once Britain deployed night fighters and ground batteries armed with incendiary ammunition, travel to London under the vast gas bags seemed like a very bad idea. The first airship raids over Britain began in January 1915, and the first raid on London the following May. Although sporadic, the raids were successful. Not only did the raids destroy a fair number of war supplies and cost many lives, they also forced the British to divert valuable resources of aircraft and men from the Western Front. In late 1916, the Germans launched the most ambitious airship bombing offensive of the war. It was a disaster. Waiting for the German airships was the Home Defense Wing flying BE-2C biplanes. When an airship raid was detected, they took off from airstrips lit by flares. Once in the air, they relied on the faintly visible line of the horizon to keep their sense of balance and hold the aircraft on a true heading. On patrol for 3 hours, the wing was about to give up when suddenly the SL-11 was bathed in the light of a dozen searchlights on the ground. Armed with explosive and incendiary ammunition, the Brits drove toward the airship and came up under its nose, raking it with fire from bow to stern. Lieutenant William Leif Robinson was on his third pass when he noticed the airship began to glow. The event was visible for miles. Londoners who had been the dying ship's target began to cheer. The blaze was also witnessed with a very different sentiment by Captain Ernst Lehmann, commander of the SL-11 sister ship, now heading for home.
I saw far behind us a bright ball of fire. Poor fellows. They were lost the moment the ship took fire. Zeppelin Captain Ernst Lehmann.
The Germans lost 4 ships and crews, including their best pilot, Captain Heinrich Matthey, who leaped to his death from his burning Zeppelin rather than being roasted alive. Leif Robinson was awarded the Victoria Cross for his victory, only to be killed the following year on the Western Front. The German High Command responded to this setback with a new type of airship that was bigger but lighter than the previous ones. These high climbers flew at over 16,000 feet, out of reach of ground fire and most aircraft. But if the crews could safely climb out of reach of the enemy, they could not escape the deadly grip of Mother Nature. For hours on end, they endured freezing cold. The thin air made them nauseated, and the rapid change of pressure gave them the bends. They inflicted minor damage on the British homeland. Strategic bombing of industrial targets was adopted in 1918 by the new Royal Air Force and was advocated in France by General Pétain. By that time, bombers, such as the Handley Page, could carry a bomb load of around 2,000 pounds. Targets were industrial sites and railroad stations. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Trenchard told his pilots they need not be too careful of civilian lives, though in practice he concentrated on tactical rather than strategic bombing. During this period, this force carried out 142 raids, of which 57 were over German territory. That these bombing raids began to have a serious effect on the German morale, already severely strained by civil unrest, was evidenced by a rapid increase in the enemy fighter defenses. By the fall of 1918, the bomber had developed enough that long-range raids were possible. On the last day of the war, the RAF had several long-range bombers ready to take off for a raid on Berlin.